Hello and welcome back to Understanding the Old Testament. We're in our third session now, which is about Moses and the law. So we started with the Torah, that is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We talked mainly about Genesis last time, and mainly really about the first 3 chapters of Genesis. We're going to talk about a lot more than 3 chapters today, because we have to, if we're going to get through the entire Old Testament in 6 lessons. We've already gotten through 2. But today we're going to talk about the rest of the law, the rest of the Torah. And we're going to focus on that issue of Sinai, Moses, and the law. So most Christians, if they hear about the law, what they hear or understand is something that puts Moses kind of like in competition with Jesus, and that Moses is the one that is all about the law and about legalism, and this is often associated with Jews and Judaism and the Pharisees, and all that is lumped into a kind of a negative column where you're trying to earn your salvation, and this is, Judaism, according to many Christians, is the religion of earning salvation by works, and that Jesus comes to fulfill and kind of get rid of the law, to throw the law away with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and Jesus' resurrection, which does away with the debt that humanity owes because we were guilty under the law, and now the law just serves to show us that we're wrong, but then Jesus gives us grace to kind of get out of the law. What this sets up is this dichotomy where there's like an Old Testament angry God that's a God of wrath and law and legalism, and then there's this kind of New Testament God, which is emphasized by Jesus, which is about love and caring and goodness. And so Christians are all about love and grace and forgiveness, and Jews are all about laws and legalism and bad things. This is not right by any stretch of the imagination. This is just a very incorrect message. No Jew has ever said, I'm going to earn my salvation through good works. Jews don't say, I'm going to earn God's grace through good works. This is not how Judaism has ever worked. This is not what Moses thought was happening in the Bible. You can see this clearly, and we'll take a look at a couple of passages today that are very clear about this as well. The law is given as a gift. That is, the covenant is made with Israel as grace alone. God saves Israel from bondage in Egypt to Pharaoh, and God liberates them. That's grace. The Hebrews don't earn this. They don't work for it. God hears their cries and responds by liberating them. And then God offers them the covenant to be in relationship with God. And as we'll see, this is a miraculous thing, a wonderful thing. This is a thing to be joyous about, and it's not a burden. The instructions that come with the Torah are meant to give Israel a shape and a structure to protect people primarily, to protect people from each other, and to generate a community of care. So that's going to be what we take a look at today, and we're going to look at a bunch of different texts from Exodus and Deuteronomy in particular to talk about this, and a couple of texts from Numbers. So when Jesus also says things like, I came to fulfill the law, but he also says, the law's not going away. If you read the book of Matthew carefully, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is very, very careful in the Gospel of Matthew to say, look, the law still matters. All that stuff that God says in Exodus is great. But also Jesus says stuff like, you've heard it said, and then he'll quote some Old Testament law, and then he'll say, but I say to you. And my argument today is going to be that Jesus doesn't come to give some new kind of grace that wasn't found in the Old Testament, but also that Jesus participates in the same kind of reinterpretation of the law that even takes place in Sinai itself. We'll come back to that at the end. So, all to say, the Old Testament God is a God of grace. The New Testament God is a God of grace. The Old Testament God is a God of judgment, but so is the God of the New Testament. God judges people who are hurting other people. And thank God. God does that. God cares about us. Just like if you're a parent and you have 2 kids and one of the kids is wailing on the other, I would hope you'd step in and give a timeout to the kid who was hurting the other kid, right? That is to say, I hope you protect the weak, the vulnerable, within your own communities, within your own families. And I hope that there are times and places where you exercise judgment, right? You say, no, that's not the right thing to do, or you can't have that now, right? That is to say that God exercises judgment because God cares about people. That's the message of the Old Testament and the message of the New Testament, is that judgment and grace go hand in hand with one another. One doesn't do away with the other. So what I'd like to do is this, to do a little overview of much of the Bible. Well, that's a bit of an overstatement, but let me summarize a bit of the story of the Torah, but also explain a bit along the way about why there is a covenant and why there is a law. Why there is legal stuff. That is to say, there's the Ten Commandments, which sound kind of legalish. And then there's legal materials. There's laws, real laws that are in Exodus 20 to 24 and throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and some ritual codes and things like this that we find in Leviticus and in Numbers. That is not laws really, but ritual standards, ritual procedures. And we'll talk a little bit about all of that. So let me first start with this. I try to tell my students in my introduction to the Old Testament classes that there's two parts to the Bible. You're probably familiar with this. But instead of Old Testament and New Testament, I tell them there's Genesis 1 through 11, and then there's Genesis 12 all the way through Revelation. What I mean is this. In Genesis 1 through 11, God is trying to do something to fix, or starting by creating, but then fixing the whole world. That is to say, the problems with the world show up in the first couple chapters. Of course, there are problems with humanity, and there are other problems that follow suit because of humanity's issues of overstepping boundaries that God has created. These boundary stepping violations repeat. So there's the boundary violation in Genesis 3 of taking the fruit that was forbidden. There's the boundary violation of harming your neighbor or harming your brother and harming your relative in Genesis 4. There's all kinds of overstepping issues that occur elsewhere, but there's also this kind of violation of kind of a boundary between humanity and the divine in Genesis 6. It's a very strange story. I don't have time here to get into it, maybe some other time. But there's the flood story. And so God is trying to fix the problems of humanity with big, single-focused action. So God's going to fix the problems in humanity by flooding the earth, getting rid of all the bad people. Well, if you've read the Noah story closely, you know that at the beginning of the story, God says, people have problems in their hearts, so I'm going to get rid of all the bad people and keep the good ones. And at the end of the story, God says in Genesis 9, oh, now I realize that all people are bad, and you can't get rid of all the bad in the human heart. And there's no people who are purely good. Because even Noah, the first thing he does when he lands is plant a vineyard, and then he gets drunk, and then there's some sort of problem with his family that's difficult to interpret, and we don't really know exactly what the problem was, but nonetheless, there's conflict and chaos that occurs in Noah's family just after he lands, and he was supposed to be the good one, right? So that is to say, God says, well, I know that the human heart is just going to have problems, and so God's going to have to do something different. And then in Genesis 11, we have the Tower of Babel story, where all of humanity works together to try to do something. It's kind of unclear exactly what. They build a tower with its top in the heavens. The Bible doesn't say anything about people attacking God or something. This is how it's often understood, but it's unclear exactly what the problem is. But the problem does seem to be that the people are all in one place doing one thing, and that God wants them to be spread around. God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And instead of filling the earth, the people were kind of gathering and concentrating in one place. And God said, no, I want diversity. So God moves the people apart, and the tower is left unbuilt. So all to say that this is God trying to fix the problem of humanity by dealing with all of humanity at once. And it doesn't really work. This problem persists. So in Genesis 12, we get this shift, a shift away from God trying to fix all people at once, trying to get rid of all the bad somehow, through rules or through floods, right? Through trying to spread people around. That none of those single solutions work. So in Genesis 12, God picks one family, starting with one person, Abram, and Sarah, his wife, and these two people really receive the call of God to go to a new place, and God's going to work with them. It's unclear exactly what God is going to do in this call here. In Genesis 12, if we want to turn to Genesis 12, we can read this together. It says, now Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred to your father's house and your father's house. So leave all these places. And your father's house doesn't mean just a physical house. It means like your household. The space that your family has to live in, that makes sense, right, for you to live in. So go, just leave the place where your life is organized, which is scary today, but was even scarier in the ancient world, where there were little rights and kind of privileges that people had outside of their homes. But also whether you're wandering around in a place where there's scarce water and food. So this is difficult, right? You're putting your life in God's hands, literally. So go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'm just going to show you later. Trust me. There's no name here. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So we hear about blessings and curses here. The point here is that God lays out the plan of what's going to take place in Genesis 12 all the way through to the end of Revelation 21, the end of the New Testament. That is, that God is going to try to bless all the families of the earth. And we hear that in Revelation that there's a vision that John of Patmos has of the heavenly throne, and there's people of every nation, language, and tongue who are worshiping God. So we see this kind of come to fruition, right? But at the same time, this is the blessing here. This is the promise here in Genesis 12 that God is going to do these things. And so it's all about blessing. Everything else that happens in the Bible is about blessing. But there are curses, right? So in other words, God is going to bless the ones who bless you. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's the point. But in the middle there's a little phrase, and in Hebrew there's this little, the grammar basically puts this like in parentheses, it's like a little aside. So the point is that I'm going to bless you, I want to bless those who bless you, and I want to eventually bless all the families of the earth through blessing you. That's God's idea. I'm going to fix one family and work really hard on this one family, and over a long period of time, eventually the blessing will spread to all the nations of the earth. It's a very big change from the flood, or it's a very big change from how God tries to kind of fix the problem with the Tower of Babel, right? This kind of instantaneous solution, which doesn't work. And here we have a change. God's going to put a lot of effort into this one family, and God knows they're going to mess up, and they're going to be attacked. So the one who curses you, I will curse. It doesn't say every single person is, like this is not a plural, this is a singular. If there is one who curses you, and it's that word, the first curse word actually isn't the word curse. It's funny, there's two different Hebrew words here. The one who makes light of you, it's kind of like mocks you, but it's more than mocking. Really, it's one who tries to end you, one who tries to diminish you, one who tries to suppress you. If there are people who try to destroy this family of blessing, and we see them throughout the Bible, right? People try to destroy this family of blessing, to reduce them to nothing. God is going to get involved at that point. Not for the purpose of cursing. God doesn't like cursing. God doesn't want to curse. This is only in preservation of the family. This is in defense of the family. We're going to see this kind of issue come up where throughout our time together, where there's God gets angry, God gets wrathful, God does things that are violent. This is all done kind of in defense of the people. So God throws Pharaoh into the sea, but only after giving Pharaoh lots of opportunities to change, and Pharaoh decides not to, and then Pharaoh threatens the family of the promise. And at that point, God gets involved and eventually throws Pharaoh into the sea. Why doesn't God just snap the divine fingers and solve the problem, make it so Pharaoh never existed, or change Pharaoh's heart immediately? I don't know why. The Bible doesn't explain that, but what it does say is that God gives lots of chances to people, and then eventually God gets involved. When God gets involved directly to protect the family of promise from being harmed, God is going to sweep away those who threaten. So this is the biblical witness. This kind of stuff is talked about in the book of Revelation as well. It's not an Old Testament thing. This is an Old Testament and a New Testament thing. So all to say, this is the whole kind of gospel in miniature is found in Genesis 12 verses 1 through 3. So I call this kind of the beginning of the story that we're going to follow here of the law. This is also why biblical scholars say Genesis 1 through 11 is the primeval history. Primeval meaning kind of before time. This is the kind of a different way that God related to the world. So eventually there's a family that wanders in Canaan, right? That's the rest of the book of Genesis is following this family, right? There's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Jacob, there's disputes between Jacob and Esau and so on. There's Joseph and Joseph's family. We can follow the stories of the ancestors throughout Genesis. If you're more interested in some deeper dives into those, I have some videos that I've linked where I go into depth into those stories, but we don't have time to do that today. But just to say that family ends up going down into Egypt in order to be preserved in the end of the Joseph story, right? Joseph goes down to Egypt. He's sold into Egypt as an enslaved person because his brothers were jealous of him, right? Tried to murder him. He was rescued and then sold into slavery into Egypt. He becomes elevated under Pharaoh and becomes the chief, the chief administrator of Egypt, and saves Egypt from famine and saves the people around Egypt from famine. And that's why Jacob and Jacob's family, Joseph's family, ends up coming down to Egypt. Of course, there's that famous scene of reconciliation between the brothers. But the family then stays in Egypt and over time becomes very powerful. And when we get to the book of Exodus, there's a change. The Pharaoh who once knew Joseph dies, and there's a new Pharaoh who comes along, and that new Pharaoh is going to change things. So it begins, these are the names. This is Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And we hear this, the names of the tribes and so on. Then verse 6, then Joseph died and all his brothers, that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. The land was filled with them. And then a new king arose over Egypt in verse 8, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous, more powerful. Let's deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and then join our enemies and fight against us and run the land. So they're going to lose the land to these Israelites if they don't do something. So then there's this attempt to try to suppress the Israelites, and then there's the enslavement of the Israelites, making their lives bitter with service. Verse 13, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in the tasks they imposed on them. And then there's the attempt to suppress Hebrew children and kill Hebrew children who had just been born, and the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, become heroes by kind of pretending that the Israelite women had already given birth, the Hebrew women had given birth, and so then they kind of cover for these children. Of course, then you have the birth of Moses, right? Moses is born, his mother puts him in the water, and so on. He's raised in the house of Pharaoh. And we get to this bit of chapter 2 where we see that God kind of has this plan in a way. We can start to see this at work. Moses, in the end of chapter 2, verse 23, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. This word for cry, it's the Hebrew word zak, and it means to literally to cry out in it's not necessarily a prayer word, but it can be a prayer word. It's often used in prayer. Abel's blood cries out to God from the ground when he is killed by Cain. That's in Genesis 4. And here in Exodus 2, we've got this crying out. The Israelites are crying out because of this oppression, and God hears this cry. This is really important. God hears the cries of people who are vulnerable, who have been hurt, who have been taken advantage of, who have been oppressed, who have been given harsh tasks, right, who have been treated unfairly. God hears those cries in a special way. And then verse 25, God looked upon the Israelites and God took notice of them. So God recognized God's going to get involved, right, starting at this point. And then we have the story of the burning bush. Let me just kind of explain this just a little bit, but we have this crazy story about Moses, right? So Moses is keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. Moses has killed an Egyptian to kind of side with the Hebrews, who he learns he's a Hebrew, but he's living in luxury. He sees, this is in chapter 2, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man, and he gets involved and kills the Egyptian and to defend the Hebrew man. And then the Hebrews and the Egyptians both get mad at him. The Hebrews don't want him on their side because he's the kid of a pharaoh, right? He's not really one of them. And then the Egyptians get mad and kick him out. So he goes and wanders around the Midianites. He's like wandering in the desert. And he's not one of them either. But he gets married to one of them, and now he's got a father-in-law who's one of these Midianites, and he leads this flock beyond the wilderness. So Moses, who is he? What is he? Is he an Israelite? Is he a Hebrew? Is he an Egyptian? He's like kind of nothing. Is he a Midianite guy now? Not really. He's got no identity to speak of exactly. And he comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. The idea is that God kind of lives in this mountain in the middle of nowhere, which is an interesting thing too. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in this burning bush. And God calls to Moses, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, naming these family members and saying, you're part of this family too, right? Giving him an identity. And then God says, I've heard this cry of the Israelites. I'm going to get involved. So I'm going to send you. Verse 10, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? It's really a big question for Moses' life. Who am I? And God says, I will be with you, which is not really an answer to the question, who am I? But then again, it's the only answer that really matters to Moses. Who am I? Well, I'm the one that God is with. And then God says, I'll give you a sign. That sign is that one day you're going to come back here and worship with the people. And Moses says, what? That's not a good sign. I want a sign now, right? But in any event, then Moses says, well, what if I go to these people that you're sending me to? And I say, well, God sent me, but which God, right? There's lots of gods out there. Which God? And God says, I am who I am, or really in Hebrew, it's better. I mean, I am who I am doesn't work in Hebrew. There's no way to say that in Hebrew exactly. I will be who I will be is what the Hebrew says here. You can say in a way like I was what I was, or I will be what I will be, but I am what I am is not It's not possible to say that in Hebrew very clearly. What the Hebrew actually says here is, I will be whatever I will be. It's a way of saying freedom, right? God is the free one. But also, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh sounds a little bit like Yahweh. So I will be whatever I will be, and Yahweh can be understood to be like the one who makes be. The one who makes futures possible, the one who makes things possible. It's kind of the name of God. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, Ehyeh has sent me to you, or I am, or I will be, really is what that means, has sent me to you. And then God said, so say, Yahweh, the one who makes things be, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, sent me to you. Okay, so then God gets involved. Moses goes, and there's, we don't have time for all the plagues and things like this. But what ends up happening is that Moses continually goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. God, this is what God says. God says the people have to go. The Hebrews have to go. Let them go. And Pharaoh says, no. There are times where it says Pharaoh hardens his own heart. It says that God, the Bible also says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Both of these things happen. Hardening of the heart, in ancient Hebrew, heart really means mind. They thought you thought with your heart, and they thought you felt with your guts. So modern English speakers think heart means like feelings, and head or brain means thoughts. Well, in ancient Israel, in the ancient Near East as a whole, they thought your brains were just kind of cotton stuffing. They didn't think your brains did anything. They thought you thought with your heart, and you felt with your guts. Your emotions were in your guts, your stomach, your kidneys, your liver. So when it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that really is the word for brain, like the thinking, right? Being stubborn. Pharaoh wouldn't change his thinking, and then God made it so that Pharaoh wouldn't change his thinking. Both of those things happen. But the point is that God says that God is doing all of these wonders so that the people will know, so that people around the world will know the name of Yahweh, so that all the families of the world will be blessed. And then we have this, of course, the story of the Exodus in chapters 14 and 15, the crossing of the sea. God miraculously parts the sea. Pharaoh and his army try to kill this family of promise, and God gets involved by splitting the sea, allowing them to cross, and then covering the sea over on the Egyptian army. There's a beautiful song that Miriam and Moses sing in chapter 15. And then they wander for a bit, right? They wander in the wilderness, and they eventually come in chapter 19 of Exodus. They come to Sinai. Now, this is, I think, a really important part, because they end up at this mountain, right? This mountain where Moses met God before, and where God said, I heard your cry, I'm going to help you, and I'm going to bring you back here, and you're going to worship. Okay, so on the third new moon, this is Exodus chapter 19, verse 1. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out from the land of Egypt on that very day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord, or Yahweh, called to him from the mountain, saying, and so this is the point. Why are we here? Why did you bring us out to the wilderness, to the desert, to this mountain? Why did you bring us here? God said, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and to the Israelites. So tell the people this. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So the first word here is a story. It's a narrative, and it's a story of salvation. God saved the Hebrews. You have seen how I saved you. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians to save you. You've seen how I carried you here to save you. That's grace. They didn't earn it. They didn't deserve it. God saved them by grace. God saved the people by grace and brought them to Sinai. Now, therefore, verse 5, now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So they're saved by grace. They've been rescued. They're standing there in Sinai, and it was grace that brought them there. Now, they have a choice. The choice is this. If they want to be God's treasured possession out of all the peoples, then they got to do something about it. They have to listen to God's voice and keep the covenant. So they're going to make an agreement. A covenant is sounds like a fancy word. Sounds like a theological word used in church primarily. But in the ancient world, the word for covenant did not mean anything fancy. It just meant a deal. A deal. God's going to make a deal with you. And in fact, the only God that we know in the ancient world that makes a covenant with anyone is Yahweh. So Marduk, the god of Babylon, never makes covenants according to the Babylonians. No Egyptian ever claims that their gods made covenants with them. The reason is that would be demeaning for a God in the ancient world. Gods don't make deals with people. Gods don't sign contracts with people. If you sold a house in the ancient world, you signed a covenant. If you got married, you signed a covenant. That was the kind of agreement, right? The official agreement. If you made a loan, you would sign a contract, right? You'd sign a covenant. It's an agreement, the deal. So God doesn't sign deals with people. The gods don't cut deals with people, right? Gods are above that. They tell you how things work, right? But the God of Israel, Yahweh, made a deal with them, made a covenant, an agreement with them. And you can call an agreement both ways, right? So that Israel's got this document they can wave around and say, you promised us. They can call God to account. And in fact, the Psalms do that all the time. You promised us. Listen up. And the prophets do this all the time too. The prophets yell at the people about not following the covenant, but also sometimes they yell at God for not following the covenant. Jeremiah says this. He said, God, don't be a liar, Jeremiah says. So all to say that this is a really powerful idea in the ancient world, a crazy idea. So God is saying here in Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 6, I'm going to make you my treasured possession out of all the peoples if you follow this covenant. You don't have to. You can say no thank you and walk away, and you'll still be rescued. You'll still be saved by God. I've still rescued you, right? At the same time, you can say no thanks, and there can be, maybe I'll find someone else to be my treasured people. But what does it mean to be a treasured people? And then that next verse 6, you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. To be priestly, to be holy is to be set aside for God's special use. Holy doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean great. I mean, the temple was holy, but it wasn't perfect. People built it. It had stones that were slightly the wrong size, right? It wasn't full 90-degree angles, right? People can't build like that. People build things with little mistakes, with flaws, because we're people. The lampstand, the menorah that was in the temple was holy, but it was made by a person, so I'm sure it had little flaws in it. Holy doesn't mean perfect in the ancient world. It means set aside for God's special use. A space that was holy was a space that was set aside for God's special use. So you're going to be a holy people. You're going to be a people set aside for God's special use in the world. And what are you going to be? You're going to be priests. They're not all going to be actual priests. There's certain people in Israel who can be priests and certain people who aren't, but you're going to be metaphorical priests to all of the world. Out of all the peoples on the earth, you're going to be metaphorical priests to them. And how are you going to do that? Well, what do priests do? Well, they mediate God's blessing. And they mediate God's anger, right? They tell people, don't do this, don't do that, right? They teach people about who God is. They serve at the altar, right? They hear people's cries. They give people pastoral care and comfort. They teach people about God. They're God's representatives in the world. Well, that's what you're going to be. The whole people is going to be that to all the peoples of the world. But you got to agree to this deal, and you got to work at it to be part of this. So they're not earning salvation through following the covenant. They're becoming the people of God in the world by striving to follow God and to be open to following God's call. It's a very different thing than how most Christians understand how the covenant works. So this, and how the law works, right? And so this is the beginning of it, right? They get to Sinai, and God says, I want to make a deal with you, okay? And that deal's got stipulations. And the stipulations, that's what we call the law, right? These kind of codes, right? Here's how to be in the world. And God's trying to give them a sense of order. They've been enslaved for a long time and oppressed. God's trying to give them a sense of how to be a community together. And that's they're going to be organized in this new way. So that's the whole idea of the law. Really, if you think of the law, that word Torah, really meaning instruction. God's teaching them how to be in the world. God's teaching them how to become a holy people, a blessed people. So here we go. As I said, a covenant is a deal, and we can see that Exodus chapters 20 through 24 are structured as a covenant. At the end of chapter 24, there's a meal they have on the mountain. The elders go up and celebrate this meal with God. That's what you do after signing a covenant. Just like you sign a big business deal and maybe you all go to dinner together or something, or you sign a wedding contract in the ancient world, or in a modern Jewish wedding. If you go to a Jewish wedding today, they get married officially when they sign the ketubah, the wedding contract, and it really is a literal contract. And it's beautiful, usually like written up in this, calligraphy and things. And so you sign this ketubah, and then you're officially married. And then what do? You have a big party with your family and friends to celebrate the covenant, right? Sometimes you sell a house in the ancient world, and then you'd have a little party, right? Well, like to celebrate sealing the deal. Well, they sealed the deal. And in chapter 24, on top of the mountain, that is, they're having a party with God in order to seal this covenant deal that they've made. They say yes to it. And they can say no. They could say no, but they say yes to it. So the beginning of this kind of covenant here is chapter 20, verse 2. and it's the 10 Commandments. The beginning of this covenant is that these 10 Commandments, and in fact, 10 Commandments, that phrase is not used in the Bible. The phrase that's used is the 10 words or the 10 sayings. Commandments is an interpretive thing, gloss added later. It's an interpretive statement about this that Christians added later. But the 10 words is what ancient Israelites called it and what Jews call it. And the first of them, according to the Jewish numbering system, it doesn't say 1, 2, 3, right? In the ancient text, it just has a bunch of things afterwards. So then God spoke these words: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. In the Christian numbering system, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, is the prologue, and then you shall have no other gods before me is the first commandment. But in Jewish tradition, the first commandment is I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It's a story. Because it's not a commandment, it's a saying. And it's a story about grace. I am Yahweh, your God, the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who rescued you out of the house of slavery. Boom. Salvation comes first. Grace comes first. And then after that, there's a requirement, a request for an exclusive relationship. You shall have no other gods before me, in my presence. It's just you and me. A covenant was used for a wedding contract. Right, this is one of the big ways that someone in the ancient world would encounter covenants was by getting married, and you'd sign this little covenant. Well, God wants an exclusive covenant with Israel. There's no cheating by worshiping other gods. Now, this is a big change from how ancient people think about gods. In the ancient world, there are lots of gods out there, according to the Greeks, according to the Romans, according to the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Canaanites. They all believe there's tons of gods out there, and they all believe that you should worship all of them. You might have to pick a subset to worship, the ones that are more important to you, whatever, but you never tell someone to stop worshiping a different god or something. And you can't take over a foreign people and make them stop worshiping their god. That wasn't an idea that the Mesopotamians ever had or that the Egyptians ever had. They said, of course you got to worship your own gods. There's no exclusive loyalty deals with gods in the ancient world, except in Israel. They're the only ones to have this covenant, this exclusive relationship. God wants it to be like a marriage. All right, so exclusive relationship. The part of the deal, I think, is that God is trying to get Israel to live in a different way from the peoples around them, to live in a way to be a holy priestly nation that tries to bring God's blessing to all the nations of the earth. That's not the express purpose of any Mesopotamian civilization. It's not the express purpose of the ancient Egyptian civilization. They were out there to get as much as they could for themselves. That's how ancient civilizations lived, and it's actually how most modern nations live as well. So all to say that this Israel was trying to be countercultural. Yahweh wanted Israel to be completely different. And in order to do that, worshiping a god in the ancient world meant kind of following after that god's way of life, conforming your life to that god's mode of being in the world. You worship a god, that god lives in a temple, that god needs to be fed, right? You're going to have to farm to feed that god. That god says that people are dirt and slaves to the gods. Well, that's the way you got to be, right? Yahweh's trying to come with a very different way to get people to think about themselves, to think about each other, to think about their role in the world, and so on. And so God says, don't listen to those other voices out there. This has got to be an exclusive deal. So don't make any idols and worship these other things, right? Verse 7, don't lift up my name in vain. So in other words, don't use my name for things that it shouldn't be used for. Respect my name. And then remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So give people rest, give animals rest, give the land rest. Everything gets rest because I said so, because they deserve it. And then honor your father and mother, honor the elderly, and so on. And then don't kill people, don't steal, right? God's telling them certain things that they shouldn't do in order to be the kind of community that's going to respect each other, right? That's going to live together in harmony and peace and be able to mediate God's blessing to all the peoples of the world. And then we get to kind of laws and things, right? I'll talk more about the laws in just a minute. Oh, sorry, I already went to the Ten Commandments. Here's a little image of Rembrandt's version of the Ten Commandments with Moses with two tablets. He's about to break them, probably here in this painting. But nonetheless, so these laws that we see in chapters 21 through 24 will strike us as, if we read them carefully, as some of them great and some of them quite terrible. So, for example, in chapter 23 of Exodus, we can read a couple of these laws and say, oh, great, these are good. Okay, so, for example, 6, you shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in the lawsuits. So don't just, listen to poor people and take their accounts seriously. and pay attention to them, right? Keep from a false charge and do not kill the innocent and those in the right, for I will not acquit the guilty. God says, I'm going to protect the innocent, right? You shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the officials and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. So justice. God wants justice. So then verse 9, you shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So some interesting things here that we might just not get if we look at these things immediately. I'm going to move on to some things that we might not get here. These are countercultural and radical laws about communal well-being. So in the ancient world, it was pretty clear that the law was not there to protect all people equally. That was never stated by any ancient law code except Israel's, right here, right? It's supposed to be for everyone. Everyone's supposed to be protected under this law equally. In ancient Mesopotamia, they had different laws for rich people and different laws for poor people, and then different laws for slaves, right? There were different laws for different groups of people, and in Egypt you find the same thing. This was normal, right? In ancient Rome, they even laughed at people who would suggest that there should be, like, you shouldn't defer to the rich person in court of law. Of course you defer to the rich person. They're rich, they're powerful, right? But here in ancient Israel, we hear about this idea, don't pervert the justice due to your poor in their lawsuits, verse 6. Now what's so radical about that? First of all, in the ancient world, there wasn't a word for poor. Ancient Israel kind of invents this. That word there is lack, one who lacks. But, you know, a rich person could lack something. A rich person can lack, I don't know, can go for a long walk and run out of water. And they're rich, but they don't have any water, right? They lack water. But here, what this means, in Exodus and especially in Deuteronomy, it's used a lot, and it becomes a technical term. Israel uses this word for lack, and they're like, somebody who lacks things all the time. That's bad. Now, this is absolutely radical, because in the ancient Near East, there's no such thing as poverty. Poverty is a condition that is bad, and you should get out of it, or you should help people get out of it. In the ancient world, if you didn't have a lot of stuff, that was the point. You were a peasant. The gods gave you that lot in life. You were not supposed to have much. What you had, you were supposed to give to the temple, and of course the wealthy priests take it and the elite take it. But that's the way the world is set up, according to people in the ancient world. They don't ever talk about poverty and, you know, like there's somebody who's missing something, or, you know, whatever. In ancient Israel, there's this idea that everyone is supposed to have access to land. This is actually a core part of ancient Israelite culture, is that everyone is supposed to have access to land, that they are given indefinitely, that no one can ever take away from you. This is called the nachalah, the kind of inheritance or the birthright. The idea is that every single person is supposed to get access to enough land to take care of themselves and their family. And in Leviticus, if you lose that land, the next generation gets it back. Right? This is the idea of Jubilee, right? You're going to restore people's lands to them in perpetuity, right? You can never lose your land. You can lose it for a little bit if you're, don't take care of it, or if you gamble it away or something, but the next generation is going to get it back. This is a way to say everyone has a right to have the things that they need to have a good life. Not just bare existence, but to have a good life. And so if there's poor out there in the land, you're supposed to actually, Deuteronomy says, fix this thing. So let's turn real quick to Deuteronomy 15. I know we got to jump over. Deuteronomy is a second telling of the law right before they come into the land. So they get the law at Sinai. They will have to wander around in the wilderness for quite some time, as we will learn in the book of Numbers. And then when they get to Deuteronomy, they're about to go into the land, and Moses is kind of telling them the law again. But Moses also, he adds some stuff to it, right? So let's look at the end of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15. So the end of chapter 14 in Deuteronomy, starting with verse 22, it says, set apart a tithe of all the yield of your seed that's brought in yearly from the field, and so on. Okay, so you do have to give some stuff to God, right? Some of your produce. But look at this, verse 28, every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce that year and store it in your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, so some of the priestish people are supposed to get some of that. Levites aren't really fully priests. All priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. But in any event, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, the widows in your towns, they may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you undertake. You're supposed to take your tithe, and instead of bringing it to the temple, you're supposed to give it out, dole it out to the people who need it. Who needs it? Well, the priests, but also the resident aliens, the wanderers, wandering people. Just like Abram was a wanderer way back when. God said, go out and wander out there, right? I'm going to take care of you. Well, You know the heart of a wandering person. In Exodus 23:9, you shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And so you see these classes of people are tied together here. Poor, orphan, widow. So people who don't have someone to take care of them, right? People who are vulnerable, people who can easily be oppressed. And resident alien is top on that list. We don't have a single law code in the ancient world that even mentions resident aliens because they don't have any rights, except in Israel, where they are given full rights. You can't oppress these people. You can't hurt them. They have access to your food. You're supposed to take care of them. I mean, that's just kind of amazing, right? That is to say that this idea of whole communal well-being, community not just meaning people that look like me or whatever, but anyone who comes into our community, we're supposed to look after their well-being. But we're supposed to especially take care of the poor, the orphan, the widow, the vulnerable, wandering stranger, and so on. And why? Because God hears the cry of the oppressed Israelite, the cry of Abel's blood, this cry is going to raise up to their ears. And in fact, if we go back to Exodus, we can see this very clearly here. If we look at Exodus 22:21, it says, you shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And here we get a kind of explanation, like an encouragement for you to follow the law. You were aliens once in the land of Egypt, and I cared for you, so you should care for them. These kind of like encouragements are not found in law codes. You won't find them in the law code of the state of Georgia or the law code of the United States federal government. You will not find this in ancient law codes like the Code of Hammurabi. Here's why you should follow the law. But here, the point is that God wants you to become the kind of person who wants to follow these laws. It's not just about following laws. It's about changing, transformation. This is instruction or teaching. It's teaching someone how to become the kind of person who's going to care for those who are oppressed because you were once oppressed and God cared for you. You were once a wanderer and God cared for you. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. So again, these wanderers, widows, orphans, all kind of put together. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, there's that cry word, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn. Why is God mad? God's mad because you're trying to take advantage and hurt vulnerable people. Just like if I walk into a room of a bunch of kids and I see a bunch of kids picking on someone who's smaller than them or someone who's weaker than them or picking on a kid whose parent isn't there to take care of them and everyone else is just kind of looking around and not caring what's happening, I'm going to get mad. I'm going to get mad at those little kids for picking on someone else, right? I'm not going to say, oh, everyone's great. This is just fine what I'm seeing right here. No, I'm going to get personally involved and I'm going to say, stop it, right? God's wrath will burn because God gets angry because God cares deeply about these people who are being hurt. And then God says, and I will, this is the part that's crazy here, chapter 22 of Exodus, verse 24, I will kill you with the sword and your wives shall become widows and your children orphans. Which sounds nuts. I'll just say that, right? Okay, so I will kill you with the sword, God says. Now, this doesn't happen. People take advantage of poor widows and orphans all the time in Israel, and God never comes and throws a sword from the sky and kills anyone. What this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor that would have made a lot of sense in ancient Israel. Ancient people would have gotten this immediately. Okay, so in the book of Ruth, right? Ruth is kind of a vulnerable wanderer, and she's a foreigner, right? And she's poor. And she gets to glean from the fields, right? And then it turns out that she has a redeemer, right? Boaz ends up becoming her redeemer and taking care of her. That figure of a redeemer is a kinsman redeemer, right? A kinsperson, a family member. It's a job of a person in the family, distant relative, whatever it is, like try to take care of those people in their community who they can take care of. So powerful people are supposed to look after the less powerful around them. They are supposed to feel responsible for them. And part of that is defending them. So if someone tries to attack my kids, I will get in the way. I'll fight back. I mean, I'm not a angry person, I'm not a violent person, but look, someone tries to attack my children, I'm going to defend them. That's part of being a dad, I think. So I'm not going to watch someone hurt my kids, right? So in the same way, God looks and sees the divine children, right? God sees people who are made in the image of God, and someone is taking advantage of them and hurting them. And the way that God can communicate, I am their kinsman redeemer. They don't have a kinsman redeemer. They're an orphan. The people who are supposed to take care of them are dead. They're a widow. In ancient Israelite society, Widows were made vulnerable by the death of their husbands if they weren't within some larger community group that was taking care of them. So, for example, Naomi, right, in the book of Ruth, she is made vulnerable because she is now the kind of one in charge of her family, and she's an elderly woman. Elderly people are often taken advantage of and often not taken care of well in our society, and in the ancient society that was true as well. So all to say that this elderly widows were oftentimes left to die or were not taken care of. So God looks down and says, I will be your defender. The Goel Hadam, the avenger of blood is what this name of this kinsman redeemer sometimes was. That is to say, like, I'm going to fight for you. This is God is saying, I claim them. I'm their divine parent, and I take responsibility for them. You try to fight them, you're going to fight me. And the way God does this is not by throwing literal swords out of the sky, but God keeps yelling. God yells through the prophets. And when we talk about the prophets, we'll talk about these texts where the prophets literally quote this text. Jeremiah quotes this text and says, he's yelling at the people who run the temple and they run Jerusalem. And he's saying, you are hurting the poor among us. You are hurting the vulnerable. If you stop hurting the vulnerable, God will be with us. God will take care of us. If you don't stop hurting the vulnerable, God is going to knock this city down because it's built on blood. So the prophets are literally quoting these verses here, and it sounds violent and it sounds angry. I'm not going to quote these on the street. I wouldn't walk around and say to people, hey, God's going to kill people with the sword, right? I wouldn't say this stuff now because our culture is different. Our way of speaking is different. Our metaphors are different. But you know what I would say? I would do the translation of this. I would say God is the defender of the weak and vulnerable. God is the one who takes responsibility for the weak and vulnerable. God is the one who promises to look after the weak and vulnerable. And if you hurt them, you're inviting God to get involved. So all to say that this kind of looking after a whole community sense of well-being where everyone has access to land. This is that crucial part of ancient Israelite culture where people have access to land. Over time that wears away. We'll get to that when the prophets start to yell at the kings about taking people's land from them. But there's all kinds of other things we can find in these texts. But that's one of the crucial parts for me, and that's what sets it apart most. A lot of these laws sound a lot like other laws, and in fact, some of these laws are literally taken from earlier law codes from Mesopotamia, like the laws of Hammurabi. There's an ox goring law here in Exodus. It's just taken straight from the laws of Hammurabi. It's almost word for word. These laws of Hammurabi were passed around. There were lots of copies of them. They were famous. They weren't followed in the way that we follow law codes. They weren't functioning like law codes, but they were more like wisdom about how to run a community. So there was like guidelines that you wouldn't really follow, but you would kind of use them as kind of wise ideas, and then you would implement them differently in your own community. But all to say that those kinds of laws are kind of borrowed all over the place here in Exodus. But the thing that sets Exodus chapters 20 through 24 apart from other ancient law codes is this concern for the weak, for the vulnerable, for those who are widows and orphans and the poor, the invention of the category of the poor, in the sense that justice is for all, that justice needs to happen for everyone or it's not happening for anyone. And that God gets involved on behalf of the vulnerable. This is an image of ancient Libyans that the Egyptians made, showing how wonderful. This is like bragging. We starved them to death in battle. We besieged their city and made them die. So these poor, sick, famished Libyan people are depicted here in triumph, really. But you can think of these ancient Israelites looking at pictures like this and saying, "No, I'm moved by empathy for these people, right? I want to care for them. That God wants us to care for them." And this is what really sets Israel apart as radically different in their law code. So there are also problems in the law code. There are big problems and little problems. Some of the big problems is that ancient Israel is an ancient Eastern culture, and the laws reflect that. The laws don't fix everything. Remember, God doesn't fix everything all at once. God fixes things little bits by little bits. And so the laws here reflect the laws of the peoples around them. There are changes. There are some things like adding in little changes here and there. God fixes things little bits at a time. God puts in stuff about the poor, the vulnerable, the wanderers, the widows and orphans, and so on. But there are terrible laws in here. Chapter 21 of Exodus is all about slavery. It's about laws about, and it doesn't say that slavery's wrong. It says when you go out and buy slaves. So this is terrible to me. I look at this, I say that's unjust. Now, I might be tempted to say, but God made the law, so it's got to be perfect, so slavery's got to be okay. Or I might just say, I might be reading that wrong, I don't know how, but I'm just going to avoid that and never talk about that. Instead, I think we should take a cue from the Bible itself, and we should say, that's a problem. And then we should say, what do we do about that? And in fact, we have stories about this in the Bible. If you turn with me to Numbers chapter 8. So Numbers is a book that takes place while they're, the beginning of it, they're still on Sinai. They're still at Sinai. They're at Sinai. They arrive at Sinai at Exodus 19. They're at Sinai until Numbers 10. So it's a long time. The whole book of Leviticus is dictated at Sinai. Exodus, the whole second half of it, they're at Sinai. And the whole first 10 chapters of Numbers, they're at Sinai. And then they leave. Then they have to wander in the wilderness and so on for a while. We'll get to that. But Numbers, they're still at Sinai, right? And there's this problem that emerges. I said Numbers 8, but it's Numbers 9, actually. And it's about the Passover. This is a much later medieval image of the Passover taking place at Passover Seder, but it's a Passover image from Jewish sources. But so here, chapter 9 of Numbers. God spoke to Moses in the wilderness at Sinai, and God said, verse 2, "Let the Israelites keep their Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its statutes and regulations, you shall keep it." Okay, keep the Passover, keep the Passover, keep the Passover. So Moses told the Israelites they should keep the Passover. They kept the Passover in the first month. On the 14th day of the month at twilight, that's the day God told them. This is all the way back in Exodus 12. God says, do the Passover. Great. So here they say, God says, do the Passover. Great. We'll do the Passover. But, problem, verse 6. Now there were certain people who were unclean through touching a corpse, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. Now, this is not wrong or bad. Being unclean isn't a sin. Being unclean just means you did something that renders you not possible to go into a temple that day or into a holy space that day. This is a whole big issue. I've got a video on this that's about holiness and purity that I'll link below. So if you're interested in issues of holiness and purity, I can't get into that all now, but all to say, just trust me that when you're unclean, that isn't a negative like moral issue. It's just a ritual problem. You can't go into the temple right now. You can't go into the holy place right now, the sanctuary, the tabernacle. You can't go into those places right now. But so there are people who have to do these things, touch a corpse. Well, you have to bury your relatives. It's an important thing to take care of the bodies of the people who you love. So let's say your uncle dies and you have to take care of the body. So you help bury the body. And they say it's the day before Passover. You don't want to leave your uncle's body lying around. So you bury your uncle according to the rituals. And then at the end of it, you say, well, Passover's tomorrow, but now I just don't get to do Passover. I can't go near the holy place where everyone's going to be doing this ritual. That's a bummer. What do we do now? So then they go to Moses. These people who can't do if their job is that they're a gravedigger. Someone is a mortuary worker, right? They have to touch dead bodies, and then they're not supposed to go to the temple. So verse 7. So they go to Moses and they say, although we are unclean through touching a corpse, why must we be kept from presenting the Lord's offering at its appointed time among the Israelites? Why can't we go do the party at the Passover? Verse 8, Moses said to them, wait, so that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. He doesn't say, no, it's God's law, can't change it. Instead he says, good point. Verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, and so Moses goes and asks God, and God says, speak to the Israelites, saying, and then what God doesn't say is, I said it, I wrote it in stone. You can't change it. There's nothing, I'm God, so if I said it, it stays. No, God says, okay, any one of you or your descendants who's unclean through touching a corpse or is away in a journey shall still keep the Passover to the Lord, but in the second month on the 14th day. So 1 month later, there's a do-over Passover for you. We're going to make an exclusion of the law, and we're going to say, okay, you were set away apart from the law. You got to do the Passover the next month. Great. We just got a second Passover. God, they haven't even left Sinai yet. And God's already changing the divine law, adding new things to it because it was not right. Why was it not right? It wasn't right because there were some people who were left out. There were some people who didn't receive the full inclusion in the community. And so it was the responsibility of people in the community to say, this isn't right. And it's the responsibility of the leadership, that's Moses, to say, you're right, this isn't the way it should be. And then they go to God and they say, what are we supposed to do? And then God says, let's change the law. Whoa, change the law. let's amend the Constitution, God says, right? Let's add something, like it's not covering all people, let's fix it, right? So that's a kind of amazing thing. Now, there's another story about this that's even more surprising. That's Numbers 27. The daughters of Zelophehad is the story. Okay, so there's a rebellion that happens, and this guy named Korah is at the root of the rebellion. That's in the book of Numbers, but don't worry about it now, but it's referenced here, but just to explain. So the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. So they're moving around in the wilderness. They're about to come into the promised land. Zelophehad was the son of Hefer, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, a member of the Manassite clans. The point of that is to say these women are good standing Israelites. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So these 5 women stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, that is the tabernacle, and they said, so they go in front of the holy place, and they kind of yell at Moses and the leadership. And they say, our father died in the wilderness. He wasn't among the company who gathered themselves together against Yahweh in the company of Korah. In other words, our dad was not part of that rebellion. He was a good guy. He died for his own sin, and he had no sons. So he was a good guy. He had sins, but he died, and there's nothing shameful about him. But he didn't have any sons. He just had 5 daughters. Well, why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem because in ancient Israelite law, which we just heard about in Sinai, men are supposed to receive inheritance. It's passed down through the men. This is a problem, though, because these 5 women didn't do anything wrong, and the inheritance is going to go to the nearest male relative. It's going to leave all 5 of them landless. They haven't even got to the promised land yet, and they're going to be poor, and they're going to be homeless. And what man is going to marry them now that they are landless? So they say, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he has no son? Give us a possession, that is, give us land among our father's brothers. We just want some land. That's all we want. We're written out of the law. Well, Moses brought their case before the Lord. And Moses does not say, well, God's law is God's law. It can't change. Sorry. No, Moses says it's got to change, right? Moses says, God, here, listen to this. These people got written out of the law. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they're saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. God just gave new law. That's a new law. New law replacing old law. That was wrong. It was wrong not just because it was like stupid or something. It was wrong because it wrote some people out of the community's well-being. It didn't protect. It wasn't justice for all. And it was the voices of those people who had been written out of justice that raised the attention of the leadership, who then were very attentive and cared about those folks, and the community and God end up kind of working together. These women come back in Numbers 36, where there's like a second round of revision, where basically there's a new part of the law because some other clan leaders come and say, well, that new law that God gave in Numbers 27 has a loophole in it. And then they close the loophole in Numbers 36, which threatened another community value, which is equality of land between the tribes. So all to say that like these values of equality, inclusion, passing down land to family members so that they can have what they need to survive. These things, I think, are rooted in some of those things we talked about in the last couple videos, which is that everyone's made in God's image, and that Israel is being lifted up as a place of blessing and a place where all of the nations can be blessed. Everyone can be blessed here. The wanderers can be blessed here too. And the blessing is going to overflow, and it's going to fill all the nations. This is a very different way of thinking about law than we typically think about God's law, which will never change, right? And God, the amazing thing is the 10 Commandments even change. Moses changes the 10 Commandments from Exodus 20, the first time they're given, to Deuteronomy 5, when Moses tells them about the law, the 10 Commandments, and reminds them about the 10 Commandments. He changes them in order to reflect the new situation that they're going into. Moses changes laws about land ownership. He adds some stuff to the 10 Commandments because they didn't own any land in Exodus 20. They were wanderers. But now they're about to own land in Deuteronomy. They're on the edge of owning land. So Moses changes the 10 Commandments and adds some stuff about land in there. Again, new law for new circumstances to try to protect people. There's an amazing thing here in Deuteronomy 5. I just want to read you this real quick. This is one of my favorite bits of the Bible here. So it says, Moses convened all Israel. This is Deuteronomy 5. And said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I'm addressing to you today, you shall learn them and observe them diligently. So Moses is going to repeat the laws of Exodus. But Moses changes a lot of them and adds to a lot of them because that's what he does. That's what we all do. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. That's verse 2. God, Yahweh, made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, all of us who are here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain. This is a lie. It's not true. The people know it's not true. This is the new generation that's being spoken to. The old generation, besides Moses and Joshua and Caleb, is dead. Their parents are gone. This is the new generation. They were not at Sinai. Sinai was their parents' generation, and they're gone. Moses says, not with our ancestors, not with our mothers and fathers, did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, the ones who are here alive today. In other words, the covenant is about the ones who are living. And the beauty of how this is written is that every generation that picks this up, right now when we read this, it's about us. The covenant wasn't about those folks in the ancient world. It's about us, the ones who are here alive today. But we are supposed to do what Moses did. We're not supposed to just try to repeat the past. We're supposed to try to live it in the present. Look around our community. How do we implement these values that we see in these rules, these laws, these instructions? How do we take this instruction that God gave to the ancient world and how do we live it into today's community with these values about the vulnerable, taking care of the vulnerable, making sure everyone has access to the things that they need to have access to, making sure that everyone is blessed and shares in the blessing, and then it goes to all the peoples, all the nations, that it's not held back from some, and that there's justice for all. These are the kind of core ideas, I think, that we can see in this. Another thing is this kind of crazy equality you get in ancient Israel. You know, the only time in the ancient world that we hear a God speaking to a people and calling them you is in the Bible. Ancient Babylonian gods never said you to a people. They spoke to kings, they spoke to priests, but they wouldn't speak to the whole people. That would demean them, speaking to the rabble. Zeus never speaks to all Greece. They speak to important people, these ancient gods, except for Yahweh. Yahweh says you. In Exodus 20, when God says you, all the people are there to hear it. You all. It's the only time in the ancient world we know that a God addresses, or the first time at least that we know that a God addresses a whole people as you, creating them as a community. There's no king there. There's no high priest there. It's just people. So, all to say, these values that we can see there instilled in this law code are the things that Israel is going to fight about and try to preserve over the course of their lives together. And this is where the prophets come in. The prophets are those people who are called to protect this covenant, who are called to remind people about this covenant, and call them back to kind of fealty, loyalty to God, covenant loyalty to God. You ever see that word loving kindness in the Bible? It's the word chesed in Hebrew. Loving kindness is how it's sometimes translated. But that word really is covenant loyalty. And that's what God is asking. And the way to be loyal to God is to be a blessing to the people around you. So, law, Torah, the Pentateuch, that's the Christian name for the first 5 books of the Bible, the laws of Moses, the books of Moses. All of these things are foundational for all of our faith, but also for the New Testament and for Jesus. When Jesus says things like, you've heard it said, but now I say to you, he's not throwing away the law. He's doing what Moses did. That is, he's thinking about the principles that were at work in the law of Moses, and then he's implementing them in his own day in maybe different ways because his situation has changed. Jesus isn't getting rid of the law. He's updating the law for his own day in the way that Moses did, in the way that we're called to. It's for us. The covenant wasn't made with our ancestors. The covenant is being made with us, the ones who are here alive today, living now. So that leaves us on the edge of the plains of Moab at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. This is the actual plains of Moab looking over the Dead Sea, and then that's the land of Israel beyond. So next session, we're going to be in Israel with the former prophets, where we'll do a brief overview of the history of Israel, but then we'll spend most of our time at the latter prophets, that is the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and we'll be listening for God's voice among the prophets. See y'all soon.